Welcome once again to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barrett.
I'm Chaz Licciardello.
This week, is the fight to confirm a replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg already over?
We're going to talk to someone who saw the battles over Merrick Garland and Brett Kavanaugh up close, former Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp. And we're also going to preview next week's first debate and check out the latest polls.
First, though, to these fresh concerns about whether President Trump will accept the result of this November's election. The issue came up again this week after an article by Bart Gellman in The Atlantic titled "The Election That Could Break America." That was getting a lot of attention online on Wednesday. Gellman wrote, "The worst case is that Trump uses his power to prevent a decisive outcome against him." And he quotes a number of constitutional law experts, some of whom we've had on this show this year, to talk about scenarios where it's maybe going to be hard to determine the result, and a constitutional crisis could result in something of a deadlock. So here's the question that was asked by Brian Karem, the White House correspondent for Playboy magazine, and President Trump's answer as well.
Win, lose, or draw in this election, will you commit here today for a peaceful transferal of power after the election? And there has been rioting in Louisville, there's been rioting in many cities across this country, red and your so-called red and blue states. Will you commit to making sure that there is a peaceful transferal of power after the election?
Well, we're going to have to see what happens. You know that I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster.
I understand that, but people are rioting. Do you commit to making sure that there's a peaceful transferal of power?
We want to get rid of the ballots, and we'll have a very peaceful. There won't be a transfer, frankly. There'll be a continuation. The ballots are out of control. You know it. And you know who knows it better than anybody else? The Democrats know it better than anybody else. Go ahead.
Well, that led to a lot of outrage on cable news, emergency podcasts, lots of social media hand-wringing about the death of democracy in America becoming a dictatorship, although a number of newspapers basically ignored the whole flap, nothing to see. Now, obviously, there is a real issue here. Joe Biden has previously said that he is worried that Trump may not accept defeat if he loses. And Trump has been trying to discredit mail-in voting for months and months. But the way Trump's latest remarks were received, you would have thought he was calling for the Marine Corps to stop the removalists taking his Sharpie pens out of the Oval Office on the 20th of January. So, the big question, I guess, Chaz, is this a big deal or not? I tend to think, actually, there's not a lot new in this. It's kind of a beat-up. It is still shocking for a president to not say the kind of typical sort of soothing words, be presidential in this situation. He was being asked to ensure that there wouldn't be protests. Well, he can't guarantee there aren't going to be protests. He can't, if his supporters think that the result is unfair and he's planting the seeds for all of that, of course there are going to be protests. There are going to be protests on both sides pretty much whatever happens, surely.
Yeah, he can't stop his supporters. He's not going to be out there smashing windows himself. He can't guarantee there isn't going to be some kind of dissent. But I personally would suggest that there is much more likely to be, and by the way, that was a terrible answer. Let's just stipulate that was a terrible answer from Trump.
Yeah, and the we'll see sort of hedge that he uses for everything. Yeah, we'll see if Russia's going to interfere. We'll see what happens. It's his way of basically being non-committal.
That's right. But I personally think there's much more likely to be a legal standoff than a violent standoff. Trump made that very clear this week, and he wasn't messing around this time when discussing why he was so keen to get the 9th Supreme Court justice confirmed before the election.
We need 9 justices. You need that. With the unsolicited millions of ballots that they're sending, it's a scam, it's a hoax, everybody knows that. And the Democrats know it better than anybody else. So you're going to need 9 justices up there. I think it's going to be very important.
Really, though? There were only 8 justices in 2016. Wasn't an issue then.
I know. How about that? But once again, there's the obsession with the mail-in voting. But I actually think, I know, here's an exclusive for you.
Yes.
I think I know what the most likely lawsuit is going to be.
Yeah. Well, there's going to be more than one.
Yeah, well, what the Florida
The one that makes it to the 9-person Supreme Court.
That's the one. This is what I reckon it's going to be. This week, Pennsylvania, Michigan and Wisconsin all had rulings that they're going to accept mail-in ballots after Election Day if they were postmarked as being sent before Election Day. So they can arrive late.
Yep.
Right? Different amounts of days for the different states. Now, the Republicans didn't love that, but that isn't the main issue. The issue is So the Pennsylvania court held that ballots received after the election that lack a postmark or other proof of mailing, or where the postmark is illegible, will be presumed to have been mailed by Election Day, unless a preponderance of evidence shows it was mailed after Election Day. Okay, that has lawsuit written all over it. And Pennsylvania is in the Third Circuit, right, of appeals courts. That's held by Republican-appointed judges. So get ready.
Really, can't they just put a bit more toner in the mail sorting machine so they print the stamps on them? There's also in Pennsylvania, there was another ruling about so-called naked ballots as well, because with their postal system, you have to put your mail-in ballot in not one but two envelopes, so that one of them has the signatures on it, the other one is a blind one, so that as it's going through the post, you can't see, is this a ballot for Trump? Is it a ballot for Biden or whatever? There have already been reports as well of 9 votes in Pennsylvania turning up, all for Trump, all from military personnel that turned up in a river this week. But this is, I guess, part of the problem. Once you sow these seeds, any irregularities, and with 130, 140 million votes, at least half of which are going to be going through the postal system, some are going to get lost.
Yeah.
Some are going to fall off a truck, literally, and not in a sinister way. It's going to happen.
And don't forget, about 1% of mail-in ballots are rejected every single election. That's a lot of rejected ballots, considering 130 million ballots.
Yes.
And this year there'll be more, because first-time mail-in voters always stuff it up.
Right.
So it'll be more like 2 or 3%
Right,
probably.
but if you've been sending in postal ballots for 20 years, you know the routine.
Exactly.
You've got to sign the envelope.
And my point is, that's 2 or 3 million potential arguments.
Yeah.
For each of those ballots.
So much fun. Yeah. Now, the first 2020 presidential debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden is on next week, next Tuesday night in Cleveland, Ohio. That's lunchtime Wednesday here in Australia. And we will have live coverage for you on ABC News, as well as a full wrap on Wednesday night's Planet America. And as usual, there is a huge amount of anticipation and expectation setting on both sides. One of the major attacks, of course, on Joe Biden from President Trump is that he's too old, that he's either on drugs or he's demented or both. And that narrative could be blown out of the water, of course, by a strong showing next week by Joe Biden, or it could even be confirmed if Biden stumbles and fumbles for words. Both things are possible, but this week, a hasty and probably belated U-turn from President Trump. Take a look.
No, but don't underestimate him. Look, he's been doing this for 47 years. And I got a debate coming up with this guy. No, it's not. You never know. You never know. They give him a big fat shot in the ass and he comes out. And for 2 hours, he's better than ever before. The problem is, what happens after that? Nah, we're going to ask for a drug test. We are. I'd like to have a drug test. Both of us. I'll take it. He'll take it.
I mean, in that context, his comments about not having a peaceful transition are kind of mild. He is accusing his presidential rival of being mentally unfit and on drugs.
Yes, he is. With a shot in the ass.
Yeah, that was
funny.
pretty funny.
Yeah.
As both of these candidates prepare for what is going to be their first ever face-to-face encounter, they will be looking for potential triggers to throw the other guy off their game. And if Trump's team is smart, they will have watched last week's CNN town hall event with Joe Biden. This particular moment I want to show you, when he became visually quite emotional. He was actually talking about affordable health care, but his mind clearly moved to his late son Beau's fatal brain cancer from a few years ago. And then he sort of got himself all worked up, outraged at Trump's reported comments about American troops. Take a look.
The president referred to guys like my son. He won the Bronze Star, the Conspicuous Service Medal, referred to them as losers. Losers. Talk about losers. My point is this. The idea that health care is debated as whether or not it's a right or a privilege. It's an absolute right. And so we have to make sure, particularly in the moment of COVID, that any costs relating to COVID are in fact free.
Yeah, now this is a big issue right now, because potentially if pre-existing conditions are not going to be covered, and the Supreme Court is about to hear a case that'll determine that for maybe 100 million Americans or more, having had the coronavirus is going to become a pre-existing condition. So this is a big drain on the health system. But to me, that also represents a challenge for any candidate in a debate. To what extent do you make these issues personal? Do you show emotion, risking, looking too passionate, too hot, like an Ed Muskie moment from New Hampshire in '72, or do you actually keep it cool, don't let yourself get worked up, and risk the other extreme, which was Mike Dukakis in 1988? What do you do if Kitty Dukakis is raped and murdered? And he gave a sort of a technocratic answer, which when we spoke to him a month or two ago, he says he still regrets. Now, clearly with Biden, he's got this big hot button with Beau Biden's name written on it. And if Trump's people are watching that and they're doing their due diligence and their debate prep, they're going to be going for that. They're going to try and throw Joe off his game because that is still emotionally raw for him.
I reckon Joe Biden getting hot defending Beau Biden, that would play well. I don't think emotion is a problem when you have a hero son. Hunter Biden is what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Because Joe is just as personal about that. There was a report that just came out from the Senate, was it yesterday, day before? Massive beat up, but it's relevant, it's topical. Trump can bring that up. He can go as hard as he likes on Hunter Biden. He's not a hero. And Joe Biden gets just as upset. Well, that's the way to rattle him, I would say. Yeah, Biden did an interview with Axios at the start of the week where he was clearly trying to laugh off the questions about Hunter Biden. It was before that Senate report came out midweek, but it was clear that his strategy is to simply scoff at the whole thing and to say, look, this is ridiculous, da-da-da-da. And then he sort of tried to turn it on to, well, if we're going to talk about families doing dodgy things, what about Trump's family? And I'm not sure if that's going to be because we know Trump's going to go there with Hunter. I'm not sure that's going to be a good counter because, well, I don't know that voters want to see people's families dragged into this. Probably not. Now, as well as the coronavirus pandemic and the Supreme Court, another topic that moderator Chris Wallace of Fox News says will be in the debate next week is racial justice. And there were renewed Black Lives Matter protests in several cities this week, including Louisville, Kentucky, after a grand jury there declined to charge 3 officers over the shooting death of 26-year-old hospital worker Breonna Taylor in her own home back in March. Breonna Taylor was unarmed and asleep when police used a battering ram to knock down her door. Her boyfriend shot at what he says he thought were intruders. Police returned fire. Breonna was killed. One of the 3 officers has been sacked and charged with recklessly firing his weapon. The bullets went into a neighbouring apartment. Breonna's family has already received a $12 million payout in a wrongful death civil suit, but they were also demanding that the 2 officers who shot her be charged. Yeah. Brett Hankinson was the one who was indicted on 3 counts of first-degree wanton endangerment because of the 10 rounds he fired from outside the apartment. As you say, some of them entered the next-door neighbour's residence. Where there was a couple with a baby. Yes, 3 people there. Each of those 3 charges, because those 3 people, carries a potential 5-year jail sentence. Wanton endangerment, if you're interested, is when you show extreme indifference to the value of human life and wantonly engage in conduct which creates a substantial danger or death or serious physical injury to another person. That kind of checks out from what I've heard about this shooting. But why no murder charges is what people are asking. Well, let's talk through the detail of what happened. According to Kenneth Walker, Breonna Taylor's boyfriend, they were lying in bed after midnight. They heard banging at the door. He thought it might be Taylor's drug-dealing ex-boyfriend, which is why he got dressed and grabbed his gun for, okay? And it was legally his gun, so that's okay. They start yelling out, "Who is it? Who is it?" over and over again. The police keep knocking. They can't hear each other. So there's a bit of confusion going on there. And that's why the police, having not heard anything inside, blew the door off its hinges. Of course, that scares Kenneth Walker and Breonna Taylor. They're in the hallway at this point in time with their clothes. Kenneth Walker just immediately squeezes off a shot. Unfortunately for him, that shot hits a police officer. So the police are then legally justified in returning fire in self-defense. That makes sense. And that was when they shot Breonna Taylor, okay? Now, that's why there's no murder or manslaughter charges, and because they were legally justified in doing that. Why even the guy that they did ping for wanton endangerment was only charged for the bullets he fired into the neighbour's residence, not into her apartment. So yes, that's what's going on. It's actually very reasonable, but it's just extremely tragic and unfortunate, and you can see why everyone's so angry. Yeah, and obviously it's a part of this
broader Black Lives Matter narrative and the fact that there are more than 1,000 Americans killed every year by police, and a disproportionate number of them are African American men, about 5 times as a proportion to their part in the population. It's very unusual for women to be shot by police. It's about 5% of that 1,000. A lot of the focus, and it was something that both Kamala Harris and Michelle Obama, when they talked about Breonna Taylor's case back during the Democratic convention, they talked about, well, really, we want to focus the issue here not so much on the police, but on this whole notion of the no-knock warrant and the fact that you can go barging in. Now, in this case, there was knocking. Yeah. But if knocking is happening in a dangerous neighbourhood where you got people banging on a door and, we now have like, he said as to whether they identified themselves as police or not. And when somebody is banging on the door and then kicking it in or using a battering ram to do it, are you hearing them say police as they're doing that, or are you just hearing the door splintering off its hinges?
Yeah, exactly. Even if you knock, blowing the door off its hinges has a certain effect. And by the way, when I said so it's reasonable, I don't mean the actions of the police were reasonable. I mean legally it's a reasonable decision that the DA has made. And there
was a big failure in surveillance as well, because they were out, the police were out in the car park for several hours beforehand, and they thought it was the ex-boyfriend that was with her. So it was a failure of... So they were going in there thinking it is this ex-boyfriend who is, by all accounts, a bad dude, who's been busted, spent a lot of time in jail for drug dealing and weapons offences and so on. He had implicated Breonna into his affairs, not because there's any evidence that she was doing anything illegal, but she had posted bail for him and other associates. He had borrowed her car, which he had used to go and ferry drugs to and from drug houses in the neighbourhood and so on. So it is a tragic case where a young woman who was, had an important job at the start of a pandemic, working in a hospital, was looking at buying a car, buying a house, having a good life, marrying the man that she was with, and suddenly, she's dead and a bunch of lives have been ruined.
Yes.
All right. President Trump is expected to announce his 3rd nominee to the United States Supreme Court this weekend, following the death last Friday of 87-year-old Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Judges Amy Coney Barrett and Barbara Lagoya have both met with the president this week, and they are believed to be among the finalists. If one of them is confirmed, either before the election or in the lame duck session between November 3's election and the swearing in of the new Senate in early January, this will increase the Conservative majority on America's highest court to a 6-3 split. And right now, the Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell seems to have the votes he needs to push this through, Chaz. The hopes were really down to, was Mitt Romney going to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to do this? And people kind of forgot. Mitt Romney is a very conservative man.
Yes.
And the reason why he and a bunch of other conservative Republicans held their nose and put up with Trump to the extent that they have is exactly this. They wanted Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat. They were thinking about this in 2016. It's the deal they did.
Absolutely, yeah. The Democrats need 4 defections. They got 2, and this is a sign of how badly they're doing. One of those defections is starting to get a bit soft. Lisa Murkowski has started to say things like, well, how can I say if I'm going to block the nominee if I don't know who the nominee is yet? So she's starting to get a bit wobbly. For me, there's really only 2 questions left because they don't have the numbers, the Democrats, that is. The question is the final vote going to be before the election? And what can the Democrats do at all in any case? Okay, so the first one, as far as the first question goes, Judiciary Committee Chair Lindsey Graham, he's made pretty clear he's aiming for a vote before the election.
We're going to move forward in the committee. We're going to report the nomination out of the committee to the floor of the United States Senate so we can vote before the election. That's the constitutional process.
Okay, and he announced the hearings are going to be in the week of October 12, so that leaves 3 weeks for messing around before a vote, so they'll probably fit that in. The question 2, what can the Democrats do about it? Well, there's been a few things. First of all, they're talking about potentially trying to waste time through what they call privilege motions. So, for instance, if they just impeach every second person in the administration, let's just go Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, let's go Bill Barr. Every single one of them, supposedly, the Senate has to deal with a trial before it can move on to any other business. Now, obviously, the trial can be Mitch McConnell going, you're wasting my time, let's move on. But that can be... They have to go through a process which they call cloture, where they threaten to have some kind of debate, and it takes 30 hours before they have the vote. So they're wasting 30 hours of the time.
Basically
Mitch McConnell...
a 3-day delay.
Yeah, he'll make them stay up all night, all the rest of it. Can you do that for 2 months? I don't think so. But it sounds like the kind of thing that happens in a movie rather than real life. Let's see how desperate they are. But the second thing is they're talking about this packing the court thing, which I don't think is ever going to happen because I can't see conservatives like Joe Manchin and John Tester and even incoming conservative Democrats like John Hickenlooper, Kirsten Sinema as well, for that matter. None of them are going to say yes to that.
Yeah.
But
Franklin Roosevelt tried it in the 1930s. Well, he talked about it in the 1930s because there were conservative judges that were basically blocking elements of his New Deal at that time. And there was a massive public backlash against it.
And he was much more popular than the Democrats are.
Yeah.
So let's say if FDR couldn't pull it off, and also there's much more pressure these days because of social media, cable news, all the rest of it. So I would think
they wouldn't do it
hard.
on this, but if hypothetically an Amy Coney Barrett issued a ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade next year, at that point there could be greater pressure to look at stacking the court.
Maybe. I mean, Joe Manchin voted for the first two judges under Trump.
Yep.
He voted for them.
Yep.
I just can't see him agreeing to this kind of stuff. And they're not going to have more than 50 or 51 senators at the most, I would have thought, after this election. But what this does do is this puts Joe Biden in a terrible position because he needs to answer to these hypotheticals. And people are already asking him about, so, are you going to sign the legislation that packs the court? And this is what he came up with.
Would you consider adding more Supreme Court justices to the bench?
It's a legitimate question, but let me tell you, I'm not going to answer that question.
Okay.
Because it will shift all the focus. That's what he wants. He never wants to talk about the issue at hand. He always tries to change the subject. But let's say I answered that question. Then the whole debate's going to be, well, Biden said or didn't say. Biden said he would or wouldn't. That's going to, the discussion should be about why he is moving in a direction that's totally inconsistent with what the founders wanted. The Constitution says the voters get to pick the president who gets to make the pick and the Senate who gets to decide. We're in the middle of an election right now, Brittany. You know, people are voting now.
Now, let's leave aside the argument about the president gets to pick and the Senate gets to decide because that's what's happening right now.
That's what they're doing, yeah.
Exactly. Although I should say this is the first time in history I know of where there's a pick happening after people have begun voting.
Yeah.
But anyway, but that aside, Joe Biden cannot do that for 6 weeks. He cannot for 6 weeks say, I'm not going to answer your question and I'll tell you why. At some point in time, he needs to answer it. And at some point in time, they're going to, if they get this nominee through before the election, they're going to say, so are you going to pack the courts or not? And if he says anything other than no, then Trump can say, look, Joe Biden's going to destroy the Supreme Court. Yeah. And if he says no, the Democrats will get all demoralised and they're not going to turn out. And so he's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It's a hard situation for Joe Biden, this packing the court.
He needs to develop a Trump-like, well, we'll see what happens kind of answer. That kind of gets you through a lot of these sticky situations. Well, look, let's get some more on this Senate confirmation battle. We're joined by somebody who's very familiar with such fights. Former Democratic Senator Heidi Heitkamp represented the state of North Dakota until last year. She had a front row seat during the standoff over President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland in 2016, then the Trump nominations of Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. Heidi Heitkamp, welcome back to Planet America's Fireside Chat.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with the Supreme Court. Failing some huge scandal lurking in the closet for the nominee, is it fairly safe to assume at this stage that this thing is done and dusted? There will be a Conservative put into what was Justice Ginsburg's slot?
It's going to be very, very difficult for the Senate Democrats to pull off any kind of different result. The one thing about the United States Senate is when you're the majority leader, you have tremendous amount of power, and Mitch McConnell intends to use that power to basically install a Supreme Court justice. And the reason why this is so critical is in past replacements, it's been replacing conservative judges or more moderate judges. This will be literally a 180 difference in ideology on the United States Supreme Court.
Senator, you voted against possible nominee Amy Coney Barrett when she was nominated for the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. Why was that?
I think it was, number one, I thought that her judicial expertise was greatly lacking. She's very young and also has never really practiced law. And so one might say that's a pretty critical piece. But I also was deeply concerned with some of her answers to questions in terms of whether she would be guided in her decision making by the United States Constitution or by the principles of her church, of her faith. And she consistently has said, I will be guided by the principles of my faith. And I think when you're sitting on the court, you have to recognize we're a very complex and diverse country, and faiths believe different things. And your obligation is to interpret the law as it's been written and as was intended by the framers of our Constitution. And I think that she wasn't, and admittedly said that when a conflict would arise between the doctrines of her religion and the doctrines of the U.S. Constitution, she would choose her religion.
Senator, in hindsight, do you wish the Democrats had fought harder in 2016 against the Merrick Garland blockade? Because it seemed to me like they talked about it for about a month and then kind of let it go. Like during the convention, they weren't talking about it. There weren't any big ad campaigns. In hindsight, do you think that was a mistake?
I think that everybody thought, look, we're gonna win. There's always that sense we're gonna win. And the polls were telling them they were going to win, and so it was not one of those necessarily urgent voting issues. I can tell you, I interviewed a lot of people when I was a United States Senator for a lot of different jobs. The most important, obviously, is a seat on the Supreme Court. But I have never met a finer individual than Merrick Garland. And so the tragedy of that goes beyond just losing a seat, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican. The tragedy is a very, very good human being who would have been incredible on the court, who would brought empathy and incredible learned ability, was denied that seat. And I think that's one of the problems with the system that we have today, is we're overlooking the quality of the person as a jurist, the quality of that person as a human being, and instead we're wanting to know, how are you going to vote on this case? What's the ideology that you have? I think when you nominate and appoint good people, good-hearted humans that bring that empathy to the court, that's the job of the United States Senate.
What sort of reforms do you think are worth considering, Senator? There has been talk about the possibility of expanding the Supreme Court from 9 to maybe 12 or maybe more. Also, discussion as to whether we should now recognise that the filibuster, well, it's become a rubber stamp for Mitch McConnell to get judges confirmed, but it's become a roadblock to get any legislation passed, so maybe the filibuster should go as well.
People in this country, in America, are tired of people not governing and getting things done. And so I think that when people come together and they don't act in good faith, they're simply being obstructionist, and that can happen on both sides, then we aren't doing the job of the United States Senate. We aren't doing the job that Article 1 of our Constitution has imposed on the body, our legislative body. And so, it's going to be really interesting. I doubt that you're going to see an expansion of the court. There's been a number of members, Democratic members, who have already said that they are not in favor of that. I think it'll be, if the Democrats get the majority, it'll be by the slimmest of margins. And so it's kind of a non-starter. I think the real problem that you have right now with our jurisprudence and with what's happening in our country is you have, by Congress not being Congress, by Article 1, which basically creates our legislative branch, when they take a back seat to the executive gets more powerful. And once those norms break down, it's really hard to take back that power from the executive, because there's all that, well, he did it, back and forth, that seems like kindergarten language, but yet it's not consistent with our Constitution.
To achieve any of these kinds of reforms we're talking about here, Senator, you'd probably be required to end the filibuster. Do you see the potential for 50 Democrats in the 2021 Congress agreeing to end the filibuster, given there's people like Joe Manchin and John Tester there?
I think that it would be tragic, honestly, and this will get me in trouble in my country. I think it'd be tragic to eliminate the legislative filibuster, but it's going to be really, really hard to prevent that from happening when you have a base that says, look, they wielded that power, and now you're willing to go back to the old rules when we now have suffered under their 50 vote rule. But it's going to be hard to hold back that kind of pressure from the Democratic base.
Why would you say abolishing the filibuster would be a tragedy? Because a lot of people simply see it as obstruction, getting in the way of the democratic will.
Because I think that as long as the filibuster used to only be applied very rarely. It's only in the last 10, 15 years that it basically has been, if you want to pass something, it better have 60 votes or it's not going to pass. I think the challenge that you have is wide swings. What do I mean by that? If the Democrats are in charge, they're going to, expand the Affordable Care Act with 60 votes. They're going to regulate this with 60 or with 50 votes. They're going to do all of these things with 50 votes. Well, no one is permanently in the majority in our country. These things swing back and forth. You've got to play a little chess and not checkers with this, and you got to realize what goes around comes around. And a lot of the things that the Democrats have been able to stop for a number of years, because even when they were in the minority, now will be threatened when they lose that majority.
Heidi Heitkamp, great to talk to you again. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. You guys stay warm.
Now, I know there are a million things to talk about this week, but we do need to briefly acknowledge that America has now suffered 200,000 official deaths at the hands of COVID-19. And I say official deaths because as of the end of August, there were 259,000 more deaths this year than you'd have expected to have occurred. So that's a rough indicator of how many deaths there have actually been. If you want to know just how much this is affecting America, according to YouGov, about 20% of Americans have now experienced the death of a close friend or family member because of COVID-19. It's a very serious situation that Joe Biden has found a way to wildly demagogue.
If the president had done his job from the beginning, all the people would still be alive. All the people, I'm not making this up, just look at the data.
Okay, now as someone who looks pretty closely at the data, I can tell you it doesn't say anything about all the deaths, but as bad as that statement from Biden was, Trump somehow managed to lowball him.
It affects elderly people with heart problems and other problems. If they have other problems, that's what it really affects. That's it. In some states, thousands of people, nobody young, below the age of 18, like nobody. But it affects virtually nobody. It's an amazing thing.
COVID affects virtually nobody, John. Coming soon to an attack ad near you. But in the meantime, Trump's got other problems because we also saw this week the unveiling of the most revealing COVID whistleblower yet. Her name's Olivia Troy. She's a lifelong Republican. She worked as coronavirus advisor to Mike Pence all year, so she was present at all the coronavirus task force meetings. She is not happy.
We have been in meetings where we were supposed to be talking about the virus and either travel restrictions or how we were going to evacuate people off of cruise ships, which was a big issue at the very beginning of this pandemic, and what we're going to do with them. And he wanted to talk for 45 minutes on how upset he was with some news anchor at his preferred news network and who was going to take care of that problem. We have actual items on this agenda that we really need to discuss, and time matters right now. But instead, we're going to go resolve your concern about whatever some news anchor said off the cuff that upset you. That is who President Trump is. That's what he cares about. And that is a factual story, by the way. 45 minutes of going off on Tucker Carlson about how he treated Kellyanne Conway. And Hope, are you going to call him? Who's going to call him?
Well, Mike Pence's National Security Advisor, Keith Kellogg, is not happy with her. He says that Olivia Troy worked for him and never once did she ever express any concern regarding the administration's response to the coronavirus to anyone in her chain of command, and that by not expressing concerns, she demonstrated an incredible lack of moral courage. I've got to say, a 40-something-year-old woman blowing up her entire career in the hope that she might make the tiniest difference in an election campaign, to me, is the very definition of moral courage.
Yeah.
There you go.
It's going to be interesting to see whether this is just an isolated former administration person coming out and saying, because this is the kind of thing that, they're giving background anecdotes like this to reporters all the time, but something that's prepared to come forward in that way, as you say, risking her career, is a big deal. Are others going to do the same in the next 5.5 weeks? It's because if there is a steady stream of them, that could become very, very damaging. But if it's only one person, unfortunately, an anecdote like that, well, it's just a disgruntled former employee. She was not one of our people in the first place. We inherited her. She's a Democrat, etc. Joe Biden's lead in the Real Clear Politics average of national polls this week has jumped back above 7 points. That is despite another Rasmussen poll, which points to a 1-point race. Another poll from Quinnipiac this week had Biden up by double digits. Biden leads in the top 6 battleground state averages as well: Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina and Arizona, by just under 4 points. So that's probably the better measure of where this race is at this week. Based on all of those averages, if an election had been held this week, Joe Biden would have been fine. He would have won comfortably. 353 Electoral College votes to Donald Trump's 185. There are 39 days to go. 5 weeks next Tuesday, Chaz.
Yep, and for those wondering about the final money figures from last month, because Trump didn't have his money in last week, it seems at the end of August, Biden had $466 million in cash on hand, and Trump had $325 million in cash on hand. So Biden's going to be able to catch the fancy cabs at the airport.
Yeah, and that's after his massive ad spend through August, Biden that is, and Trump went off the air after Bill Stepien came in and sort of looked at Brad Pascal's spreadsheets and said, we can't keep doing that if we want to still be in this in November. Yeah. Now, this week, Joe Biden won the endorsement of Cindy McCain, the widow, of course, of 2008 Republican presidential nominee John McCain.
Well, like everyone, I've been sitting at home and watching what's going on, and I'm distressed about it. I, like everyone else, want to have a president that will have my back, that shows empathy and compassion, who has courage and dignity in how they lead, and that's Joe Biden.
Now, Cindy McCain says those now infamous reported comments from Trump that dead American soldiers were, quote, losers and suckers, were the final straw for her. Cindy McCain says that she plans to play an active part in the rest of this campaign.
I'm hoping that I can convince suburban women who are kind of on the fence about things to come with me on this and step out of their comfort zone and join Team Biden and vote a man in who would be not only a marvelous president, who shows the character, the integrity, the values, and the wherewithal to be president.
And that's where this could be a big deal, because those traditionally Republican, white, suburban, college-educated women, they have been drifting to Joe Biden and the Democrats, indeed, in the midterms in 2018. And Cindy McCain has a certain totemic value for some of those people who were still Republicans in 2008. But President Trump was bothered enough by all of that that he sent out a tweet.
Joe Biden was John McCain's lapdog. Never a fan of John. Cindy can have Sleepy Joe.
That was kind of restrained for Trump.
I guess so. Yeah. Meanwhile, President Trump did receive the endorsement himself of Cuban Bay of Pig veterans this week, the group survivors of that failed US-backed expat invasion in 1961, which had hoped to throw Fidel Castro at the time. Here's what he said.
Today we reaffirm our ironclad solidarity with the Cuban people and our eternal conviction that freedom will prevail over the sinister forces of communism. These brave warriors fought 3 grueling days. The brutal Castro regime imprisoned them for 20 months until the United States negotiated their release. Courageous veterans here today bear witness to how socialism, radical mobs, and violent communists ruin a nation. Now the Democrat Party is unleashing socialism right within our own beautiful country. Today we proclaim that America will never be a socialist or communist country. Today we thank God for the blessings we share as citizens of the greatest country on earth, and we hope, pray, and work for the day when the people of Cuba can finally reclaim their glorious destiny.
Quite the rewriting of the history of the Bay of Pigs invasion there from President Trump, but he has been quite successful in wooing Cuban expats in Florida in particular. They are a potentially crucial voting bloc for him. There are more than 1.5 million Cuban Americans in Florida, most of them very anti-communist, and that's aimed right at them.
Yeah, and there are more of them in Florida than any other Hispanic group. Well, that's why Florida's Hispanic preferences are usually quite different to the rest of the countries.
Yeah, and speaking of Florida as well, Chaz, last week, you might recall, we spoke to Desmond Meade, who's been leading the campaign to have citizenship rights, including voting rights, restored to over 1 million former felons in the state. And we talked about the court ruling last week that demands that close to 800,000 of them have to repay all costs and debts to the state before they can register to vote. Well, this week, billionaire businessman and former Democratic presidential candidate Mike Bloomberg announced he was contributing $16 million to a $20 million fund to help around 33,000 of those former Florida felons to repay their debt and to register to vote this November, Chaz. What's interesting about that, though, is that Florida's Republican Attorney General, Ashley Moody, is not at all happy, calling for the FBI to investigate this. And Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz has gone even further, as is his wont, calling this Bloomberg donation a, quote, bribe, suggesting there may already be a criminal investigation underway. Is Mike going to jail? He'll become an ex-felon.
Yeah, I tell you what, he can bail himself out. Bloomberg, he wasn't subtle about it, I have to say. He targeted black and minority voters specifically who were already registered to vote. Not much mystery about what he was doing there. His advisor told the Washington Post he did this for two reasons. One, because it's the right thing to do, and two, because it immediately activates tens of thousands of voters who are predisposed to vote for Joe Biden. They said that. Furthermore, their memo noted that the 31,000 targeted votes are almost the margin by which Governor Ron DeSantis won in 2018. So not very subtle at all, but bribery, bit of a stretch, I would have thought.
Yes, we'll see if that just, goes into the same bunch of court cases as we've seen before. One last thing before we go there.
Yes. Last week we spoke about Joe Biden and his teleprompters. I cited Biden's apparent usage of a teleprompter while being interviewed by Tonight Show host James Corden. Well, James Corden wanted to set the record straight about that.
Just to clear this up, none of this is true. The teleprompter is for me. Now, this is back from when we were doing the shows in my garage, and that screen is what all of our guests who zoomed into the show could see. Okay? That's it. It's very similar to the screen I'm using now. Okay? So, there. That's the actual truth.
Now, I feel like that was an easy mistake to make from the Trump campaign, and me for that matter, but some mistakes are not so easy to understand. Like this week when the Trump campaign made this clip viral under the description, Joe Biden completely botches the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the United States of America, one nation, indivisible, under God, for real.
Now, they're right. That sounds nothing like the Pledge of Allegiance. But if we look at
the for real bits in there.
Yeah, it sounded a good bit. But if we look at that clip in context, it is pretty obvious that Biden was not trying to say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Think about what he's saying. He's saying if you live in a state like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, states with Democratic governors, you're not his problem. He has no obligation to you. He's not responsible for you as president, your family, or your well-being. I don't see the presidency that way. I don't pledge allegiance to red states of America or blue states of America. I pledge allegiance to the United States of America. One nation, indivisible, under God, for real. I'm running as a proud Democrat, but I'm not going to govern as a Democratic president. I'm going to govern as president.
Now, I find it impossible to believe that they weren't deliberately misleading people there. And unfortunately, the Trump campaign does this kind of thing a lot more than the Biden campaign does. So watch out. If you see an 8-second decontextualized clip being sent around by Trump supporters of Joe Biden appearing to be senile, may I suggest you check the original speech before you send that clip on to someone else. Because this kind of thing is becoming a habit.
Yeah, it sure is. We're worried about deep fakes ahead of this election, but when they're wearing face masks, it's very easy to put in edits, to redub, do all sorts of things. And they get, what do they talk about, lies get around the world twice before the truth gets their pants on. The internet's making sure of that. But that is all for another Fireside Chat. We will see you for Planet America, 9:30 p.m. Wednesday night for a roundup of the first presidential debate in Cleveland, Ohio.
And his new pet podcast, keep you going until then. You can find it there.
Bye-bye.